Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating intersection of art and law. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. We're going to start by looking at the highly technical, layered process of building a visual cinematic universe. Specifically, how to realistically destroy a skyscraper in the middle of a cityscape using visual effects. And then, we're going to totally pivot. We'll examine the layered legal frameworks you actually need to own the characters that live inside that universe. Let's get right into it. So here's the roadmap for today. 1. Crafting the visual illusion. 2. Layering the explosions. 3. Copywriting fictional characters. 4. Trademarks and publicity rights. And finally, 5. The limits of protection. All right, part 1. Crafting the visual illusion. Let's drop right into a hypothetical scenario pulled directly from our source material. Imagine you're working in an After Effects composition. You've got this handheld footage that was filmed down in Melbourne. You've got 2 actors standing in front of the city skyline, and your job is to composite a highly realistic, but totally fake, building destruction right into that background.
Now, to get a clean track on a handheld camera, you absolutely cannot have your actors confusing the software, right? So step 1 is you duplicate your footage and animate a mask to completely isolate that static background skyline from the moving actors. Once your mask is looking clean, step 2 is running the 3D camera tracker. For step 3, you pick tracking points on a parallel background building to create what's called a tracking solid. And finally, step 4, you just swap out that solid with your actual digital building image.
And as our source material wisely and very accurately points out, when you're waiting for that 3D camera tracker to do all its heavy computational math on that masked footage, yeah, go grab a coffee, grab a Coke, or some water, whatever you need, because you are going to be waiting a minute. Okay, so once you drop your super crisp digital building into the scene, it's going to look terribly out of place. The absolute key here is blending. You have to match the real skyline's slight blue tint using a curves effect. And crucially, you've got to enable motion blur so your fake building blurs exactly like the fast-moving camera footage. Then, to make the building actually look like it's sitting realistically behind the foreground structures, you create this massive 3,000 by 3,000 pixels solid layer. You draw precise masks around those foreground buildings, and you set your new building layer's track matte to alpha inverted. Boom! Suddenly your totally fake building is standing right there in the middle of a real skyline. Moving on to part 2, layering the explosions. Now that our pristine digital building is flawlessly tracked and blended into that Melbourne skyline, it's time to destroy it. To manage this without losing our minds, we group the building elements into what's called a pre-comp, just getting everything prepped for the heavy visual effects. To create that visceral, gut-punch illusion of a collapsing structure, it's all about stacking layers. First, you import pre-keyed stock explosions. Pre-keyed so you don't get those ugly black boxes around the fire. Then, you literally copy the exact 3D position coordinates from your building layer and paste them right onto the explosions so they sit perfectly in 3D space. Throw on a little glow, dial down the saturation so the fire doesn't look like a cartoon, and then for the magic touch, you animate the Y position downwards and tweak the Z rotation by just like 2 or 3 degrees. This creates this amazing illusion that the building is literally losing its balance and sagging as it collapses down behind the mat. All right, so you've done it. The building has collapsed, the smoke has cleared, but let me ask you a really fascinating question. Now that you've built this incredibly detailed world, who legally owns the characters walking away from that explosion? Well, to figure that out, we are turning to the Cyberus Intellectual Property Law Review. Which brings us to part 3, copywriting fictional characters. Here is the foundational legal rule. Copyright law does not protect mere ideas or generic concepts. It just doesn't. What it actually protects is the highly original expression that an author breathes into a work. So to go on an exclusive copyright in a character, the creator really has to flesh them out with enough original expression to make them unmistakably distinctive. It is honestly fascinating to see how the courts have historically struggled to define exactly when a character crosses that line into being protectable. Basically, we have 2 major judicial tests. The Ninth Circuit, back in the 1930s, came up with the sufficiently delineated test. This one simply asks, has the author imbued the character with enough distinctive original details? Pretty straightforward, right? Well, on the flip side, a 1954 case gave us the much stricter story being told test. This one rigidly demands that a character cannot just be a mere vehicle for the plot. The character must literally be the story itself. In fact, under this strict view, the court actually ruled that the iconic character Sam Spade from The Maltese Falcon was uncopyrightable. No way, right? And this perfectly tees up a famous, brilliant warning from Judge Learned Hand regarding that sufficiently delineated test.
He said, "The less developed a character in a play is, the less it can be copyrighted. That is the penalty an author must bear for marking them too indistinctly. The message here for creators is loud and clear. If you want to own your character, you have to do the hard work of developing them deeply." But here is where the medium completely changes the game. Look at the strict rules for purely written literary characters versus the broader protections for visual characters. A literary character is really just a word portrait. But visual characters, think comic book heroes or a super developed film character like Rocky Balboa, they have physical as well as conceptual qualities. Because of that, courts have generally found that graphically depicted characters are way more likely to be fleshed out in enough detail to warrant copyright protection. And why is that? Visual characters provide a uniform interpretation for all viewers. Think about it. When a character is purely text on a page, every single reader uses their own imagination, right? We all picture slightly different traits. But a drawing or a film portrayal, that leaves much less to the imagination, cementing that character's specific expression in a very tangible form for everyone who looks at it. Let's look at the absolute perfect case study for this: James Bond. In the case of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer versus American Honda, the court found Bond to be a highly delineated visual character. Why? Because across 16 different films, his specific traits remained rock solid. His cold-bloodedness, his overt sexuality, his absolute love of martinis, shaken, not stirred, obviously, his marksmanship, and his license to kill. These are not just vague ideas anymore. The specific combination of traits makes up a legally protected, entirely unique expression. All right, moving into part 4, trademarks and publicity rights. Let's look at a different legal layer. Because what if you don't own the copyright? Or what if your character just isn't distinctive enough for copyright? Well, trademark and publicity rights step in to offer separate, incredibly powerful shields, and they operate entirely independently of copyright law. So, let's talk trademark. This whole concept is rooted in consumer protection. It's about making sure the public isn't confused about who makes a product. If a character isn't inherently distinctive, it can actually still gain trademark protection if it achieves what's called secondary meaning. That basically means the public strongly links those specific character elements to a creator's brand. When people see those elements, they instantly assume, oh, that comes from the original creator. Now, the really crucial difference between these two areas of law comes down to duration and use. Copyright protection exists for a set period of time, regardless of whether you lock that character in a basement vault and never use it. But trademark, merely registering an image, doesn't give you perpetual rights. Trademark literally requires continuous use in commerce. But here's the kicker. As long as you keep using it as a source identifier, a trademark can last forever. Then we have the right of publicity. This is a state-based property right that gives individuals exclusive control over the commercial exploitation of their own name and likeness. And this is so interesting. This is exactly how real human actors protect the commercial value of their physical face when they portray fictional personas. It legally stops someone from taking an actor's face as a character and slapping it on a billboard to sell cars without permission, even if that third party somehow legally owned the rights to the underlying story. And finally, part 5, the limits of protection. So we've stacked copyright, trademark, and publicity rights. But these legal layers absolutely have boundaries. Intellectual property laws are fundamentally designed to strike a balance. They want to give creators private ownership as an incentive to create, while still allowing for public cultural enrichment. For instance, you absolutely cannot monopolize generic archetypes or basic stock scenes. In the legal world, these are known as scènes à faire, which basically means stock scenes and hackneyed character types. They belong entirely to the public domain. And this is a good thing. It ensures that new artists don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel. Nobody gets to own the basic concept of the evil wizard or the rogue cop who doesn't play by the rules. Also remember, copyright is strictly limited in duration. Even the absolute most detailed, delineated characters will eventually age out of private ownership. A great recent example, the estate of Arthur Conan Doyle faced this exact thing in The Mystery of the Public Domain. The Seventh Circuit Court ruled that the estate had essentially exploited the Sherlock Holmes character as far as copyright law allows. So now, the world's greatest detective has officially entered the public domain. New authors can use him in entirely new adventures without ever needing to ask for permission. Which really brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. Building a cinematic world in After Effects requires layering masks, track mats, and explosions one by one until the illusion is totally complete. In the exact same way, a fictional character starts out as just a generic idea, a public domain building block. It only becomes legally yours when you painstakingly layer on enough distinctive traits, consistent visual identifiers, and unique expressions. So I'll leave you with this to ponder.
If you render a 3D explosion, you own that specific digital file. But as a creator, what specific, unique layers are you going to add to ensure your next character becomes unmistakably and legally yours?